All right, so we are going to continue our conversation about industry and immigration with today's focus being mostly on urbanization and immigration. So as usual, don't forget about these terms. Again, they're not all in this section, but they're all somewhere in the totality of these presentations. So make sure that you're keeping up with your notebook, that you're keeping up with your reading and your watching of these videos. Look for the star. Keep these points in mind. Again, today we're going to be mostly focused on urbanization and immigration, and these questions as well, which I don't feel like I need to read again, but feel free to pause and rewind if you need to. Today we're going to talk a lot about that third one from the bottom, social Darwinism. We need to definitely be able to understand what social Darwinism is, and that term in the very last question there, our last statement, nativism as well. All right, so we're going to start with urbanization. Now, as the population grows, we talked about there being a massive amount of population growth in the late 1800s. You also see cities grow, right? We're industrializing. The cities are where the jobs are. They may be jobs in poor working conditions, like we discussed the unions addressing, but they are jobs nonetheless. And so people are moving to cities, which means there are lots of growing issues related to the growth of cities. So crime, sanitation, poverty. Also, some groups start to take advantage of the poverty of the cities, and so we start to see a lot of political corruption. There's something called political machines that form during this time period, and party bosses. So political machines are a larger organization, and these machines operate on behalf of one political party. They are led by a party boss, and it's the party boss and his employees' jobs to go and get votes. Now, today, that would mean like canvassing neighborhoods and handing out flyers and raising awareness of issues. But in this time, in the late 1800s and early America, it meant through threats of violence and intimidation, and sometimes even payouts. You know, I'll give you $10 if you go vote for this guy, and $5 more for each person that you get to vote for them. Some people were being forced to vote more than once. So it's a very serious problem of political corruption during this time. One of the best known examples of a political machine was Tammany Hall in New York City, and it would be led by a man named Boss Tweed. They're just a great name, I think. From this time period. Boss Tweed was very powerful. This political machine was very powerful. Think of them also kind of like lobbyist groups. And whatever they wanted to get their politicians to care about, the politicians did on their behalf once they got elected, because they owed their election oftentimes in large part to these political machines. Thomas Nast is a political cartoonist. Pretty much every political cartoon that we're going to look at in this class is from Thomas Nast. And one of the things that he is doing is trying to draw attention to political corruption. I'm going to enlarge this. It's still going to be a little blurry. We'll look at a better picture of it in your folder later on. But you can see the ballot up at the top, that sort of jar that this is Boss Tweed leaning next to. It's labeled as the ballot. The table that he's leaning on, it says, "In counting, there is strength." And you can see Thomas Nast's signature underneath that. What this says at the bottom is, "That's what's the matter." That's the title. And Boss Tweed is saying, "As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do? Say I." That should be a question mark. So he is saying that if he's the one counting the votes, then he is always going to be the one choosing the winner. The growth of cities, here you can sort of see where the population centers are. You see Memphis down there, steadily growing. So I want you to think about the trends that you see. The blue is the population in 1870, and the yellow is the population in 1900. So where you see the yellow is where the growth is taking place. And then how large the circles are tell you how many people are living there. So look at the populations in the East, in the South, in the West, and start to think about where people are moving versus where people used to live. Comparison of rural and urban population. What factors account for the demographic shift from rural to urban areas during this time period? So you can see the urban population is definitely growing, but the rural population is not eliminated. But look at it from 1860 with 80% rural and 20% urban to 1920, where it's just about a 50-50 split. And think about industrialization as you consider factors that drive this change. Okay, social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is going to be something that really comes into vogue in the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is this time period of the Second Industrial Age in the United States, and it's a term that actually comes from Mark Twain, the author, who described this as a gilded time. If something is gilded, it means it's covered in gold, but it's not gold. So on the surface, everyone looks rich and happy and successful, right? If you look at the entrepreneurs and the robber baron kind of crowd, the upper class. But if you sort of take off that gilding, you'll see that there is a lot of darkness underneath. So a lot of poverty, a lot of corruption. That's what Gilded Age is referring to. Social Darwinism is an idea that's based very loosely on the theories of Charles Darwin. It's not something that Charles Darwin said, but it really reinforces the idea of American individualism. And a man named Herbert Spencer is the one who's going to apply Darwin's ideas to society. So survival of the fittest. If I am wealthy, if I am doing well, it must mean because I am better suited to live in this society. If you have groups that are living in poverty, well, it's kind of too bad for them because that's just sort of the natural way of weeding out the weakest. I know that sounds horrible, and it sounds horrible because it is horrible. So if you subscribed to this social Darwinist idea, there was not a lot of reason for you to want to help those living in poverty. Now, Andrew Carnegie sort of modifies social Darwinism into something called the gospel of wealth, which is important. And here is the quote that we associate with that. He says, "This then is held to be the duty of the man of wealth. First, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display or extravagance, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds." I'm not going to read the rest of it, but essentially what he is saying is that if you are wealthy, it is your responsibility, and he's using a religious justification here, to help those underneath you. So to pay your workers better. Now, Carnegie, of course, is a leader of a lot of these companies that don't treat their workers well, right? So sometimes it's a little more practice or, do what I say, not what I do. But he did give a lot to charity, and he felt that it was his duty because he was wealthy to spread that wealth to other organizations. We do have a rebirth of reform, people who are trying to point out problems with the Gilded Age, and then other people who are challenging social Darwinism. How do we pull people out of poverty? And some examples of that are going to be in some folder assignments as well. Groups that get started during this time period. A lot of Christian groups sort of try to help the poor in these urban areas. This is the beginning of the Salvation Army, which is actually a religious it's a religious denomination. The YMCA. You also have the settlement house movement, and we want to associate a woman named Jane Addams, who starts the Hull House in Chicago, a place for you to go. If you can't afford room and board, people would bring their children. She would help educate them. Public education is starting to become a thing in the United States. There's a need to train a new workforce and to quote unquote Americanize immigrants, teach them how to be American. There is more access to education in cities than in rural areas, and African Americans are denied access to public education. This is where Booker T. Washington and his ideas in the Atlanta Compromise are going to come into play, so make sure that you take a look at those folders as well. And you also have a man named Horatio Alger who is writing to draw attention to the life of impoverished child laborers. You have Lester Frank Ward, who is essentially saying you can't focus on social Darwinism. It's not real because humans are not animals. We can make different choices than the ones before. We can help others and we can change outcomes. Other authors who sort of feel that way are Jack London, who is writing about his life circumstances and how sometimes those circumstances are not in our control. It's not because we're unfit for society. It's because society hasn't created circumstances that can make us successful. Here's some U.S. literacy and school enrollment rates, and you can see that they are rising. Enrollment rates for African Americans and other non-whites are in purple, and in blue we have enrollment rates for whites. So the African American rates goes from basically 0, right? That's pre-Civil War, or right at the end of the Civil War, to much higher, although whites are still definitely higher than African Americans there. We mentioned Mark Twain. This is a great picture of people riding bicycles. Once the bicycle was mass-produced, it became a popular mode of transportation for people who lived in the city. And I want you to think about this idea of mass production of things. If you are wealthy, you can afford stuff for the first time. This sounds so small, but it's such a big deal. Look, I'm on my bike. That means I'm wealthy. I have money. I have arrived. A lot of women become obsessed with the bicycle because guess what? Now they can leave without their husbands. Get on your bikes and ride, right? Okay, there's Mark Twain. The picture on the top right is of vaudeville. This is the age of conspicuous consumption, kind of what I mentioned before with the bicycle consumerism. People are buying stuff. More things are being made in these factories. And guess what we have now? We have a weekend, thanks to some of these unions. So what are you doing on the weekend? Are you seeing a movie maybe? You're going to vaudeville? Maybe you're watching some baseball. Maybe you're going to a saloon or the first amusement parks. So there is sort of this rise of American culture and American entertainment that we now have time for. We didn't before. There's Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is going to be nominated. It looks like my map there covered up his last name, so it just looks like it says Grover. Democrats nominate Grover. The Republicans nominate James Blaine, who had been implicated in a series of bribes. And the overwhelming support really is going to go towards Grover Cleveland. Even some Republicans jumped ship to vote for him as a Democrat because they were tired of the corruption. Republicans who voted for Democrats were called mugwumps. Mugwumps. Cleveland is going to be narrowly elected, and because of that, everyone sort of hates him. Like, he can't please either side. He's going to be our only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. So he won't be reelected, but he'll be elected again later. We do want to associate him, though, with the Interstate Commerce Act, which related specifically to monopolies and essentially said that the government can regulate railroads because it crosses state lines. He's going to preside over some conflict with tariffs. This is about the Interstate Commerce Act. The problem that's being addressed here is that railroads often charged farmers more to haul crops short distances than they charged large companies for national routes. So this is the first time Congress is going to step in to regulate business in America. In the 1888 election, we have Harrison losing the popular vote but winning the electoral vote. Let's see, what do I want to mention here? The McKinley tariff, this is a protective tariff, and also the Sherman Antitrust Act, named for legislator John Sherman. This act is going to break up monopolies and trusts that exploited consumers. We're going to come back to this a lot, but the Sherman Antitrust Act is very important for you to know. as are the Interstate Commerce Act. Essentially what's happening is government is sort of starting to realize that some of these big companies need to be reined in. So the quote that's usually pulled from the Sherman Antitrust Act is, "Any contract or combination in restraint of trade is illegal. If your company grows so big or makes agreements that harm trade, that is illegal." The act does not define what restraint of trade is. And so the law is used at first to break up unions, because if you're striking, you're restraining trade. And trade here just means commerce. Okay. Any questions? So we have President Cleveland, then President Harrison, and then later we're going to have President Cleveland again. So another little chart about the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It tries to create a fair marketplace. Why might some businesses disagree with the Sherman Antitrust Act? Oh, okay. So to wrap up here, again, I hope that you have seen these terms. And I hope that these big, broad concepts make sense to you now. Let me know if you have any questions.